It's been an exciting year here at Paragon Cars. We've had some amazing automobiles come through the dealership. So I thought, why not go through all the cars we've reviewed this year and talk about all the good, the bad, and the actually quite surprising. My name's Tom, and you're watching Paragon Cars. Let's go. Let's go chronologically and start with the BMW 440i Gran Coupe. But before we get going, hit that subscribe button and keep an eye out for the reviews linked in the top right hand corner as we go through the list of cars. Then finally, make sure to watch till the end as I'll be picking my favourite car from each category. Most fun, best all-rounder and the most surprising. So the BMW 440i Gran Coupe. It's a car that really impresses on every front. It has a fantastic motor, handles well, looks good, and can still carry 4 adults with all of their luggage. There's lots to love, but first let's just talk about the engine. It's now the very well-known B58 inline 6, a mighty motor that has always felt stronger than its claimed figures. Then, like many BMWs, the engine is connected to one of the best gearboxes ever made, the ZF 8-speed transmission. BMW have somehow given us all the benefits of a torque converter, whilst being remarkably close to a dual clutch in its shift time. Buttery smooth round town, and snappy on a B road. The only negative thing I have to say about this BMW is the steering wheel is just a little bit too thick, and the exhaust could do with just a bit more volume. Next is yet another BMW, except this one runs on a different juice. This is the 335D, and it's an absolute weapon on a British B road, and really does fly under the radar, take the badges off, and even a car enthusiast would struggle to differentiate this from a regular 320 diesel. As a daily, it's certainly up there as well, especially because of the xDrive system. Like all BMWs of this era, the interior lacks a bit of pizzazz, but makes up for it in its build quality. Again, there's not a lot wrong with this car, my only minor complaint would be the suspension. It's slightly too soft for the power the car has, and means you're waiting just a bit longer to get the car settled into a corner when comparing it to the 440i. Now we come on to our first hot hatch. Right off the bat, I can say this is one of, if not the best, handling cars in the lineup today. It's sharp, predictable, and never feels unsettled. I went into this review of this car expecting something good, and I'm glad to say not only were my expectations met, they were well exceeded. Although there are some negatives that even surprised me. Firstly, of course, it's the ride. This one can be seen either as a positive or a negative. It just depends on who's driving the car. But even in normal, it's a choppy ride on anything but smooth tarmac. Personally though, I like the suspension the way it is, and it's what makes the RS so controllable and fun. The next negative though, really is a negative, and surprisingly, it's the engine. Yes, it sounds great, yes, it's nice to use, but for 350 brake horsepower, it just doesn't deliver the pace once you're moving. Look at any of our latest videos and you'll see it's way down on the leaderboard, even though it's got the exact same power as the car that's in first place, the Revo Stage 1 Leon Cupra. It just needs an extra 50 bhp to really feel fast. It could also do with some better fuel economy, as the highest I saw on the motorway was just 34 mpg, which might not sound so bad, but when you consider the Audi RS5 and BMW 440i both managed over 40 on the same bit of road, it makes it one of the least economical cars I've reviewed this year. Overall though, it's a totally unique driving experience, and one that should really be sought after. Believe it or not, this next car was one of the rarest on the channel this year. This is an Audi A3 2-litre Quattro. and it's kind of like a low-powered S3, because that's effectively what it was, especially since this one had the mag-ride system. It's actually opened my eyes a bit, as once I was on a B road, the 190 brake horsepower that it had felt plentiful and actually allowed me to focus more on the handling of the car rather than just being a hooligan. I'd say this though, if you can't quite stretch to an S3, don't be afraid of getting one of these and getting a tasteful exhaust fitted, as you're really not missing out on much. Now comes the engine with some seats strapped to it, that being of course the 6.2 litre Mercedes C63. This car will without a doubt go down as one of the best AMGs ever made. The sheer capacity of this engine makes it feel like a hand grenade is going off on every single stroke, and the feeling you get whilst driving this car is genuinely immense. You know that tingly feeling you get whilst you're listening to your favourite song? Imagine that every single time you put your foot down. Let's just listen to it for a bit, shall we? Of course, no car is all good though. You do sit a bit too high, there's no diff, so handling is kind of pig-like, and the fuel economy will actually make you cry tears of 99 octane. But do you know what? I couldn't give a flying toss, because it's the last of its kind, and it really is the pinnacle of AMG. Next up, we're moving to the opposite side of the spectrum, big, heavy, luxurious SUVs. This is the Audi Q8, and it's still Audi's flagship SUV, for now. And it's an absolute beast. Don't let its size fool you though, as it was actually very easy to drive around town. Visibility was also good, and it certainly justifies its price tag, because it's just that one level above the rest of the Q range. Of course, the tech is cool, but the driving experience has to be seen to be believed. Or should I say, experienced. Very rarely do you feel more relaxed after a long journey, but this car really does do that. The sound ending was so good, I almost felt like I was in a recording studio or one of those sensory deprivation chambers. Okay, back to hot hatches. This is the A45 AMG, and this particular one was fully optioned out with the driver's pack and much, much more. Trying to drive this car smoothly is like trying to sharpen a hammer. You're not really using it for its intended purpose. To get the most out of it, you have to match the personality of the engine and just go absolutely apeshit on every corner you see. It's literally a Hornet reincarnate. Not particularly light on its feet, but will absolutely murk you if you try and run away. The A35, in a straight line, this was surprisingly close to the A45. It felt slightly more mature in the way it handled and was just generally a little softer. The interior was really the main attraction for me though. It was a massive step up over the previous car, and for the first time felt like one cohesive design. Everything had its place and functioned as intended. Of course, the new wheel takes some getting used to, but once you are, it makes doing everything from changing destinations to customising your drive mode that much quicker. Our first convertible is next. I've never really liked convertibles, but that was due to nearly every journalist saying they're floppy round corners and louder to travel in. Of course, 20 years ago that was almost certainly the case, but nowadays the chassis technology can cope with the extra strain, and unless you're at a track, there's no way you'd notice the lack of stiffness. Even going over bigger bumps never seemed to unsettle the car. Sound insulation was also on par with the regular hardtop, so overall I was very impressed. Oh, and of course the refreshed interior added the new wheel, digital dash and wider infotainment, and that was a much needed update for the C-Class. Now, the Audi TT, for some reason known for being, I quote, a hairdresser's car. Although I've never really understood that, as it's basically a sportier Audi A3. The handling was surprisingly good considering it's just a front wheel drive car. Steering feel was vastly different to the Audi S3/S3s that I've driven in the past, and actually in a good way. It was light, yet there was plenty of feel somehow. The only letdown for me was the lack of chassis movement. Just a little oversteer would make it something truly special. Never mind the slick gear shift and eye-catching interior, you really wouldn't think it was a 6-year-old design. Up next, a car that I had actually never given the appreciation that it deserved, the Mark II Focus RS. The one we reviewed had a couple of mods taking it up to 380 brake horsepower, and boy was it an experience. Not only was the car dynamic enough to have fun below the speed limit with, the engine is an absolute masterpiece. 5 cylinders are always good, but this one is truly special. It delivers its power the old school way and builds to this crescendo that never ever gets old. The only way I can describe the sound of this car is that the sound it produces scratches my brain in a way very few things do. A totally intoxicating experience that really is worth the money people ask for them. Right, moving on, the BMW X6 then. This was actually quite an interesting car for me, as most car enthusiasts would scrunch their nose up at the mere prospect of driving one of these. In reality though, it was a surprisingly good car. Yes, you could feel the weight, but it controlled its mass fairly well, and you could even feel the rear end pushing you out of corners. The interior was also very well put together, and actually had all the tech you'd want. Rear headroom was also nowhere near as much of an issue as journalists led it on to be. Overall, it's quite the package, and even this 30D variant was plenty quick enough for everyday use. Onwards to the VW Polo. This car is a symbol of freedom in my eyes, as it's often the first proper car a young person buys. Unlike the Ford Fiesta, the Polo is much more geared towards comfort, and it certainly does a great job of that. The platform it's built on is slightly smaller than the Mark VII Golf, but is actually bigger than the Mark IV Golf, so room on the inside is actually plentiful. Driving dynamics are of course set up purely with safety in mind, although it wasn't totally boring. Wringing the engine's neck on a B-road was surprisingly rewarding. I think the fact that it had a good manual gearbox really helped. Next up is what I can only describe as an absolute bargain. The Seat Leon Cupra is the spicy version of the Audi S3 or Golf R. Same engine, same gearbox, only its VAQ differential is mounted across the front wheels instead of sending power to the back. The one we reviewed had a Revo Stage 1 map and still remains first on our 30 to 70 leaderboard. So, to put it in perspective, this car from new is £30,000. It comes with a plethora of options as standard, unlike the Audi and the Golf, has more rear legroom than both of those cars, and with a Stage 1 map, it can outrun a brand new Audi RS5 on a roll up until about 120 miles per hour, due to its lack of drivetrain loss and its lower weight. If that's not a bargain, I don't know what is. It was even easier to get it sideways in the corners compared to the Audi S3 we reviewed. The only downside for me was the fact it had a tad more road noise and slightly less flashy interior. Coming back to SUVs, we have the brand new Audi Q3 Sportback. This car was another surprise for me, as it was surprisingly more solid feeling than the equivalent A3. A lot of that was due to the beefier suspension soaking up the bumps though. Round town, I would actually recommend this over the equivalent A3, as it dealt with speed bumps like a much more expensive car. My only gripe with this car though was the engine. Whilst drivability was good due to the low-down torque, the engine really did struggle at higher speeds due to its increased weight over the A3. Next up is the Stage 1 Audi A5 Quattro. And firstly I'll say this, it was fundamentally better to drive and more dynamic than the Audi S3. Why? Well, the suspension is actually the much more advanced double wishbone setup, and it also has proper full-time Quattro going to all 4 wheels. Combine all that with a Stage 1 map and you've basically got a rear drive bias, better balanced Audi S3 with the same power. Never mind its stunning interior, it was one of the best, most predictable cars to drive down our B road. Actually, do mind the interior, as it was and is an absolute pleasure to sit in. It's up there with one of the best interiors I've had the pleasure of using, and it blended form with function absolutely perfectly, and boy was there a lot of form. Next up, another SUV, although this one has an engine that can only be described as a masterpiece. Its name is the B58 Inline 6, and it pushes this X4 M40i to 60 in under 5 seconds. But let's ignore the engine for just a second and talk about the handling, because the folks at BMW have somehow made this handle like a proper sports car. It has real front end grip and a back end that actually moves around. For me, it was a perfect SUV, and one I would actually buy. The interior is of course like the current 3 Series and 4 Series, whilst having a tad more room. The only thing I'd say if you're considering buying one of these, do keep in mind that the suspension is nearly as stiff as the Mark III Focus RS. Yeah, that's right, this car is properly sporty. I can't imagine how stiff the full fat M version is. In fact, it's almost definitely too stiff for UK roads. Now we come to a car that I described as just nice, because, well, it is. But what does that mean? Well, imagine something you own that seems expensive at first, but just oozes quality, and it's something you wouldn't hesitate to buy again. Like a MacBook Pro, it's not the fastest, nor the most dynamic machine, but it is just ultra satisfying to use. The Audi S3 is just that. It's not that exciting to drive, but every time you get into it, you completely de-stress and just enjoy existing for a bit. For a small car, it does an amazing job of keeping unwanted noise out the cabin. That combined with the super satisfying clicky switches and eye-catching virtual cockpit make it the nicest hot hatch to travel in, full stop. Now, the Mercedes CLA 180 is up next, and it's using a 1.3 litre Renault engine. Don't be fooled though, as thankfully it still has all the qualities you expect from a Merc. Flashy interior, a good ride, and imposing looks. For a lot of people, the CLA now doesn't really make sense in their eyes, as Mercedes make a saloon version of the A-Class, so they're basically the same, right? But I want you to think of the CLA as the mini CLS. Its frameless doors and slightly more tapered rear end exude just that bit more class over the A-Class. The interior really is the same though, but that is certainly no bad thing, as it's one of the most eye-catching cabins to date, while still boasting good functionality. Another X6 now, but this is the new one, and it's massive. The previous generation car wasn't small, but this is just huge. BMW really hit it out the park though with this car, as I think it actually looks pretty good. It's powered by the aforementioned B58 and floats down the road looking for tailgates. As imposing as it is though, it was sublime to drive. Light steering, soft yet controlled suspension, and seats so comfortable they cure scoliosis. The interior was one of the best put together I've seen this year. Plenty of form without any squeaks or rattles. The crystal gear knob might seem naff at first, but it actually really livens up the cabin. Plus it's something you touch every time you get into the car, so actually it makes sense to make it out of something other than plastic for once. Now, a proper sports car. The Audi RS5 has always been the more tame of the German sports coupes, and this one does actually follow suit, but in a way I didn't quite expect. Its handling is actually pretty involving. You can adjust it on the throttle or the brake, much more than I thought you'd be able to. And if you're going down a B road, there's almost nothing that can keep up. Instead of understeer, you actually get four-wheel drifts and genuine feedback through the chassis. The interior is of course amazing, but the sport seats add yet another layer of comfort to the cabin. They are literally perfect. The only downside for me was the engine. Yes, of course it's fast, but it really does need an extra 60 horsepower to feel properly quick once you're rolling, as an M4 or a C63 alike will eat this car for breakfast. Up next, the Abarth 595 Competizione. This was a car I never really had any intention of driving, as looking at it you'd think it was pants to drive. It's a very deceiving package though, as it's by far the lightest car we drove this year. So even with only 184 brake horsepower, it wasn't far off the Mark III Focus RS in its 30 to 70 time. The rest of the experience is just hilarious. Round corners you have so much room to move the car around in, and the pedals are actually set up for left foot braking / rev matching. So overall it was pretty good. The only drawback though is how high you sit in the seat. I'm not exactly tall and my head was literally touching the ceiling. I can see why the aftermarket lowering brackets are so popular. Back to Audi now with this lovely S4 Avant. To drive, this feels like an even more refined S3, unsurprisingly. But this one has an engine note that is just exquisite and is right up there with one of my favourite cars this year. For a family of 4, it's a perfect car. Plenty of power and an interior that just leaves nothing to be desired. Unlike the RS6, getting through width restrictors and parking it in tight spaces is not only easier, but genuinely possible due to its lack of size. In fact, its size is perfect for UK roads. Dynamically, it's predictably Audi. Not boring, but never hair-raising. It's either an 8/10ths car or a 12/10ths car. That means either you go at a pretty reasonable pace, or if you really want to get it sideways, you literally have to yeet it at a corner. At 10/10ths, you'll understeer your front tyres into thin air. Moving on to the BMW 420d, except this one has a manual gearbox. This car drives so well it hurts. I don't know how they've done it, but the 2-litre diesel in this delivers its power like a big ol' NA V8. That combined with the exquisite manual gearbox makes this a car that really does just scratch that itch. I totally understand why Chris Harris said what he said. It really is just that good. Inside, it's the usual BMW, well put together, not too flashy, and perfectly functional. This was actually the only coupe we reviewed with genuinely enough room in the back for an adult though. Back to the engine though, as not only is it wonderful to use, it returns economy figures that even for a diesel are good. On a long journey, you can get well over 60 miles per gallon. What a fantastic machine. Back to hot hatches, and what a hot hatch it is. This is a Stage 1 Ford Fiesta ST, and driving it made me so annoyed that this car comes with a certain reputation, because it was one of the best cars I've ever driven. It's literally the Cocker Spaniel of cars. It just doesn't care about taking itself too seriously, yet it's actually a really good daily at the same time too. For 10 grand, you cannot get a better daily driver than this Fiesta. The gear shift is slick, the chassis is just gorgeous, and the engine delivers its power with waves of torque. Not only is the car fantastic though, the modding potential is through the roof, so you'd literally never get bored owning one of these. Okay, on to the next car, the Mercedes GLC. To start, I'll say this. This is the only SUV that I'd take over its equivalent saloon. To drive at least, it doesn't feel any larger than the C-Class, but the more advanced suspension makes it so much better to live with. More comfortable, more predictable, and just generally more solid. This particular GLC had done over 60,000 miles at the time of review, and it still felt just like new. Inside, it's a C-Class with more legroom and even more storage. Overall then, it's just a better C-Class. The only time I'd take the C-Class over the GLC is if it was a C63, because then the chassis really does come alive. Finally, we have the 420i xDrive. Dynamically, it's like every other 4 Series. Very predictable, likes oversteer, and always leaves you smiling ear to ear. Initially I thought, of course, this is going to be better than the 420d, because petrol is always better than diesel, right? Well, sadly my assumptions were wrong. Although you get the initial boost of torque, the engine dies right where the diesel does at 4500 RPM. The whole point of the petrol car is to produce more power at more RPM, and it should really want you to wring its neck. But sadly the 420i just doesn't deliver. Don't get me wrong, it's still a great car, and with an aftermarket exhaust, it'd be a hoot. But to be slower than the equivalent diesel and get worse MPG means it's a win for the heavy oil car in this instance. Now, on to the 3 categories. Let's see which cars ended up in the final 3. Let's start with the most fun to drive. This was a hard one between the C63 and the Mark II Focus RS. But for me, it's got to be that Mark II Focus RS. Mainly because it has a manual. Now, before you slate me in the comments, let me say this. No, it doesn't handle that well compared to the Mark III, and no, it's not quick around a track. But holy hell, is the Mark II something special. It's a complete pig of a car, but just makes you feel like you're the absolute bollocks when you're driving down a B road. It's left me with almost unquenchable thirst for more. Moving on, we have the best all-rounder. Now, again, this was a close one. This time between the Audi S4 and the BMW 440i Grand Coupe. But I've just got to give it to the Audi, mainly due to that Quattro system, but also because the cabin is just so damn good in the B9 series Audis. It offers everything you need in a super neat looking tidy package. Finally, the most surprising, and for me at least, there's a clear winner. And you know what? It's the BMW 420d manual. Yes, the Fiesta was very good, but you kind of expect it to be good. And my god, that 4 Series diesel with a manual totally changed my perspective on what is actually good. It's a car that teaches you about chassis dynamics like nothing else. It lets you drive at 10 tenths everywhere you go, whilst drip feeding you its personality. Then once you've learned the chassis, you realise it's actually one of the best cars you've driven. It progresses into oversteer with finesse and keeps you out of danger all the time. Well, that about sums it up for this year. I hope you guys had a good Christmas. Let's make 22 even better. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like, and why not subscribe, as all the amazing cars I spoke about today were or are still for sale, and you can check out their videos in detail on our channel now. Anyway, my name's Tom, and you've been watching Paragon Cars. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.